Our farm's 15 k's north of Holbrook, east of the highway, which makes quite a difference rainfall-wise. We've got 1,900 hectares of land that we manage. Annual rainfall is 700 mil. Last 2 years we've had over 1,000 mils each year, so we've actually effectively been green for the last 24 months here now, which is good but also pose problems. Soils are sort of brown loams, slightly acid soils and aluminium at depth, so there are a few issues as far as pasture establishment or perennial pasture establishment. We run a predominantly sheep-based enterprise. We run 14,000 to 15,000 merino sheep. We sit somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 merino ewes. A portion of those, usually about a third, is joined to a terminal sire each year, but the rest are self-replacing merino flock. It's a fine wool enterprise, so our average micron at the moment is 18 micron. We used to sit at about 21, but in the last 8 years we've dropped those 3 micron and held clean fleece weight. We are increasing a proportion of wethers in our flock as a bit of a climatic safety net, but at the moment we're predominantly a ewe-based enterprise. I suppose for us what we're looking at is trying to develop a really sustainable, resilient system, and that's both a sort of an environmental as well as a production system, and to give us the lifestyle as a young couple with a young family that we're after. Kate Sargent delivered a rotational / strategic grazing course in Holbrook, and I got on board on that, and it was probably one of the best courses I've done in a very long time, and from there I've sort of become more actively involved in the machinations of EverGraze. We inherited a 2,000 head ewe flock when Tony and I started running the farm. While they were a very easy care flock, in the current wool market at the time it wasn't a particularly economic flock. And so we sat down, we decided we're either going to get out of sheep or we've got to improve the economics of that flock. And so we put a lot of time, money and effort into selecting a different genetic path and bringing those genetics in very quickly. So we actually started up a ram breeding nucleus, did a lot of ET work, sourced semen from what we thought was the best genetic sources we could find, and have made that drop due to genetics. Perennials have always been a major part of the system here. The soils tend to, being high rainfall, 700 mils, the soils can get very waterlogged in winter. So Tony's family had always been interested in putting perennials in the landscape, and had put a lot of trees back in the landscape to try and, I suppose, capture that rainfall, turn it into a product, but also to sort of protect the soils. They did a lot of work when direct drilling came into being and started trying to put phalaris in the landscape. And then when Tony and I took over the farm, that sort of technology was really sort of hitting its peak. The economics of farming were there to lime this country and to sow it down to perennial pasture. And so in the last 8-10 years, we've gone from probably the farm being 20% to a third perennials to being, well, probably 90% of grazed area in phalaris subclover based pastures. For us it stabilises the land and delivers us a great predictable feed wedge, and we also think that it allows you to utilise whatever rainfall falls on your property. So we've got less runoff, it's more infiltration, and then we can turn that into feed. Coming out of EverGraze, so not only have we put more phalaris back in the landscape, but we're now looking at trying to put a bit more lucerne back in the landscape, which will give us a bit more responsiveness in the summer period as well. Well, in the drought, the peak of the drought, which I would call 06, 07 here, we received 280 mil rainfall, and in that particular year there was no, or very little growth in that spring, summer, autumn period. But what we found is that once the autumn break came, we'd recognised that our perennial pastures were our capital asset. So the stock, but the pastures needed nurturing, so we destocked everything and were in stock containment areas. When the autumn break happened, it was amazing how quickly the country recovered, and the perennial species were there and they recovered quickly, and they gave us a bulk of dry matter very early. The annual pastures that are here are all sort of so yes, they sort of look green quickly, but they don't give you the bulk of the dry matter, whereas the perennial pastures really bounced back, and we were incredibly pleased with how resilient they'd been. One of the things I like about EverGraze is that it balances animal production and the persistence of that capital asset being your pasture, and so that you get long-term return on investment. Our thinking has sort of starting to change a bit, having looked at some of the results out of the Wagga EverGraze site. One of our biggest feed gaps now is merino weaner summer feed. Depending on how many crossbred lambs we keep, we usually have over 4,000 merino weaners to keep alive, and then crossbred lambs that we can make the decision whether to sell as stores or to finish. So summer high protein feed is an absolute premium. We've done quite a lot of work with brassicas, but you know, it's an annual investment, and so we started looking at lucerne again, and looking at why lucerne probably didn't persist over the drought, and we'd probably tended to go for more high performance winter active species, whereas we saw our current thinking is that maybe we go with a less winter active species, and that actually the economics of, you know, maybe it's not going to be a 10 or 15 year lucerne stand for us, but if we can get sort of 7 or 8 years, it actually stacks up against annual brassica turnover. How we've adopted EverGraze principles is we run large mobs of sheep, so we haven't carved our paddocks up into smaller lots, so our paddocks still sit at sort of 30 or 40 hectares. So we run, as you can see in the background here, mobs of 2,500 sheep in one mob, and they move strategically around the pastures based on growth stage and dry matter available. For us, it has allowed us to run a high stocking rate, so sort of greater production per hectare. It's allowed us to monitor feed available and plan our feed budgets going forward, and hopefully alert us to when we're coming to a squeeze or when the season doesn't look to be going in our favour earlier, and to plan for that. I also think that we've been able to maintain a more consistent feed profile. So there's less sort of boom and bust and less senescing pasture, so there's the quality I think is more consistent. In these big boom years, I think the big mobs have been essential for phalaris pastures, because you haven't had great big stands of rank phalaris. We've been able to keep them down in their vegetative state and high quality feed. For us, this system works incredibly well. I would say, unless you want to actively manage your stock, you know, the bigger mobs do have more animal health issues that you have to keep on top of. But having said that, you actually have to monitor less mobs around the farm. So if you are monitoring them when you're moving them, it's easy to keep on top of things as well. This was never cropping property, and then after the drought we had what were our remaining annual pasture paddocks, which had been used as a bit of the sacrifice during the drought. And looking at the economics of how to get them quickly into perennial pastures, or relatively quickly into perennial pastures, we thought, well, if they go into a cropping phase, the crop can effectively pay for the lime and clean them up, and then we'll get beautiful pasture establishment. So that's where it came about, but it also, grazing crops for us fill the winter feed gap. So I think they will stay in the system, and we will try to stabilise the rotation as far as crop and pasture establishments. Going forward and into the future, we're still wanting to increase our flock size, but we'll do that in a sort of a steady state increase, looking at seasons and as we develop more put more perennial pastures in and improve varieties, sort of track that stocking rate increase. I think cropping will stay part of the system because it just fills a nice feed gap, and it allows us to put lime out and things like that. I would like to solve the problem of summer, this protein issue. Hopefully we're moving down a path that will deliver that, but time will tell. Some of the new work that's coming out on lotus and bits and pieces that may also fit into the picture.